There are some historical figures that just leave you speechless. How do you even begin to comprehend a man who was, for his country, both a deity and the spawn of hell? I'm talking about Marshal Philippe Pétain, a figure so controversial that even 80 years after World War II, the French are ready to tear each other apart arguing about him. Literally. I'm not joking. In November 2025, can you believe it? Just recently, a crazy story unfolded in Verdun, France. A group of enthusiasts calling themselves the Association for the Defense of Marshal Pétain's Memory decided to hold a mass in his honor. About 20 people showed up at the church. Outside, a crowd of protesters gathered, about 100 people, screaming that it was an insult to the memory of Nazi victims. Things got so heated that the prefect of the department announced he would file a lawsuit for revisionism. The president of the Jewish organization CRIF stated harshly, "Holding a mass for Pétain means glorifying collaborationism and rehabilitating a traitor to the nation. And this isn't 1945. This is 2025. People are still ready to fight to the death over a single name." That's your answer to why it's worth digging into the story. Because it's not over. Still with us. Today, I don't just want to recount a biography from a textbook. I want us to try together to get inside this man's head, to understand how it happened that a national hero, the victor of Verdun, the pride of France at 84 years old, signed a surrender to Hitler. And not just signed it, but shook his hand on camera. Then for 4 years led a collaborationist government, gave orders to round up Jews and send them to camps, all while sincerely believing he was saving France. This is a story about how fear turns heroes into traitors, about how age and wisdom are not the same thing, and about how the most terrifying court is the court of history, which never delivers a final verdict. The golden boy who waited 58 years for his moment. First, let's understand who we're even dealing with. Without that, you can't grasp the scale of the tragedy. Philippe Pétain was born in 1856 into a peasant family. An ordinary guy from the countryside, nothing special. At 20, he entered the prestigious Saint-Cyr Military Academy, and then began an ordinary military career. Ordinary to the point of tedium. He served in various garrisons, commanded battalions, but performed no particular feats. By age 58, he had reached the rank of colonel and was already eyeing a house, planning to retire and live out his days peacefully. And here's where it gets interesting. In 1914, World War I erupted, and Pétain, who had spent his entire career in garrisons without even participating in colonial campaigns, suddenly blossomed. Why? Because he had brains, not just ambition. At that time, the French army was dominated by the idiotic doctrine of offensive à outrance, all-out attack. All the generals believed that the main thing was to advance with banners flying, and the enemy would flee. Pétain, even while teaching at the war school, had drilled a simple idea into his students: firepower kills. Sounds banal, but for that time it was heresy. He said, "Guys, machine guns and artillery will annihilate any attack. You need to stay on the defensive, dig trenches, and use technology." And when the war started, the truth was on his side. French generals sent infantry charging into machine gun fire, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers died for a patch of mud. But Pétain, he protected his men. In 1916, Verdun happened. The Germans decided to bleed the French army white in a meat grinder. They pounded Verdun with heavy artillery, threw elite divisions into the attack. And here Pétain used his tactics. He organized the famous Voie sacrée, Sacred Way, the only road through which a continuous stream of trucks flowed with reinforcements and ammunition. He didn't leave the same divisions in that hell for months like the Germans. He rotated them every 2 weeks. During the battle, 70% of the French army's personnel passed through Verdun. Everyone experienced that hell, but not everyone died there completely. The soldiers adored him. That's when the legend was born. The victor of Verdun. The man who supposedly said the famous line, "They shall not pass," though his subordinate Nivelle actually said it. But who cares? Pétain became a symbol of resilience, common sense, and paternal care for his soldiers. Later, in 1917, when the army was shaken by massive mutinies after the failed Nivelle offensive, Pétain was the one thrown in to restore order. And you know what he did? He didn't resort to mass executions. He went to the soldiers and said, "Boys, I understand you. There will be no more suicidal attacks. Rest up, go on leave, see your families." Out of 3,400 court-martial sentences, fewer than 10% were actually executed. The rest were pardoned. To the soldiers, he became more than just a commander. He became a father. By the end of the war, Pétain was a Marshal of France, holder of the highest awards, member of the Académie Française. He was received by Tsar Nicholas II himself, who awarded him the Order of St. George, 4th degree. He was the nation's idol. In the 1920s and 30s, he was Vice President of the Supreme War Council, Inspector General of the Army, Minister of War. He built the Maginot Line. He suppressed uprisings in Morocco. He was a living legend. And it's crucial to understand, this wasn't just a resume. This was a man who shaped the consciousness of an entire generation of French officers. One of his students, incidentally, was a young lieutenant colonel named Charles de Gaulle, who would spend the rest of his life measuring himself against Pétain. But in the 1930s, de Gaulle was a nobody and Pétain was a god. In 1939, Pétain was 83. He went to Spain as ambassador to Franco. He was received everywhere with reverence. Life seemed to have worked out. Old age would be quiet and honorable. But history had one last, most terrible act in store for him. 1940, collapse and shame. May 1940, the Germans strike. And suddenly, it turns out that the French army, supposedly the strongest in Europe, essentially collapses in weeks. The Germans don't attack the Maginot Line head-on. They bypass it through the Ardennes, which were considered impassable for tanks. The French command panics. The government scrambles. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud tries to organize resistance. But most ministers are ready to surrender. Who do they call for help? That's right, the old Marshal. Pétain is appointed Deputy Prime Minister. He's 84, but he agrees. Why? Because he's convinced. Only his authority can save France. Only he can negotiate with the Germans on acceptable terms. And here begins the most crucial point for understanding Pétain's psychology. He was a man of World War I. For him, war meant trenches, positions, a front line, and a rear. He remembered that even in the worst moments of 14 to 18, the front held, the government functioned, and eventually Germany collapsed from exhaustion. He sincerely believed that this defeat was temporary, that France needed to catch its breath, regroup, and then, when the war dragged on, and he was sure it would, it could re-enter the fray. But he failed to understand the main thing. This war was different. It was a war of annihilation, and Hitler had no intention of negotiating. On June 22, 1940, Pétain signs the Compiègne armistice. The location is symbolic, the very same Compiègne clearing where the Germans signed their surrender in 1918. Hitler sits in the same railway carriage, looking at Pétain with deep satisfaction. The humiliation of France is complete. Under the armistice terms, France was divided into two zones: the occupied north, including Paris, and the southern free zone, administered by a French government. The spa town of Vichy became the capital of this free zone. In July, the National Assembly votes to grant full powers to Pétain. In favor, 569 votes. Against, 80. The Third Republic ceases to exist. Pétain becomes head of the French state. The words republic and liberty disappear from official use. The new motto, work, family, fatherland. The old Republican slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity, is abolished as a relic of the past. And here Pétain makes his pivotal move. On October 24, 1940, he meets with Hitler in the town of Montoire. They shake hands. Pétain announces a policy of collaboration. This was the first time the word was used officially. He thought this would be cooperation among equals. Like we, the old great France, are negotiating with Germany about how we will live together in the new Europe. He hoped that in return, the Germans would release prisoners of war. There were 2 million of them. Reduce occupation costs. France was paying 400 million francs a day to support the occupation army, and leave the colonies alone. But Hitler couldn't have cared less about his hopes. For him, collaboration meant only one thing. The French would do as the Germans said. Supply resources, send workers to factories, and hand over Jews. Who was Pétain? Traitor, savior, or just an old man? And here we get to the most painful question, one the French still debate today. What motivated Pétain? Why did the hero of Verdun, the man who defeated the Germans in World War I, suddenly become their obedient puppet? Version 1, the simplest, he was a traitor. Sold out, switched allegiances, craved power. At 84, he wanted to be a dictator and sold the country for it. This version was actively promoted by Gaullists and communists after the war. But it's too simplistic. A man who served France for 60 years is unlikely to suddenly become a conscious enemy. Version 2, championed by Pétainists to this day, he was a shield. He consciously took the blow to prevent France's total destruction. Look, they say, if not for Pétain, the Germans would have occupied the entire country, installed a Gauleiter like in Poland, and destroyed everything French entirely. But this way, the French administration, French police, navy, and colonies were preserved. Pétain created conditions to weather the storm, preserve statehood, and then, when the time came, revive France. Some even claim he played a double game. Secretly helped the resistance sabotage German orders. But there's no evidence for this. None at all. Version 3, the most tragic, he simply lost his mind. An old, tired man, frightened by the chaos, who wanted one thing, order, at any cost. There's a syndrome among the elderly. They'll tolerate anything just to avoid war, avoid disorder. As long as the children are fed and no one's shooting. Pétain saw millions of French fleeing the Germans on the roads in 1940, soldiers dying, the country collapsing. And he told himself, enough. We've fought enough. Time to negotiate. But the truth, as always, is more complex. Let's look at the concrete actions of the Vichy government. Yes, Pétain preserved the French administration. But that administration eagerly began fulfilling German orders. As early as 1940, the Vichy government passed the Statute on Jews, which excluded Jews from public life, without any German pressure, mind you. A homegrown French solution. Special services were created to Aryanize Jewish property. The Vichy police enthusiastically conducted roundups. The most horrific page was the Vel d'Hiv roundup in July 1942. French police, on their own initiative, herded 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, into a velodrome, then sent them to camps. Pétain didn't order the police to be shot. Pétain didn't utter a word of protest. He remained silent. And here the shield theory collapses. What kind of shield are you if you're sending your own citizens to the gas chambers? Yes, he didn't sign the deportation orders. His Prime Minister Laval did. But he was head of state. He bore responsibility. In total, under the Vichy regime, about 75,000 Jews were deported from France. Only a handful returned. And yet, Pétain believed he was right until his dying day. At his trial in 1945, he would say, "Only the French people can judge me. I did nothing against France." The economics and politics of betrayal. If we step away from morality and look at the situation coldly, the question arises, did Pétain even have a choice in 1940? Maybe, as some say, France simply wasn't ready to fight. The economic situation was dire. 1/3 of industrial capacity was in the occupied zone. 2 million soldiers were prisoners of war, the best workers. Germany demanded not only occupation payments but also a constant flow of raw materials, food, and industrial goods. French factories worked for the Wehrmacht. French farmers fed the German army. French workers, voluntarily and forcibly, went to work in German factories. The Vichy government tried to navigate. The policy was called attentism, waiting, a policy of the seesaw. They hoped the war would end soon, and they just had to hold on. In 1940 to 41, when Germany seemed invincible, this seemed reasonable. But there were those who chose a different path. As early as June 18, 1940, for days after the Germans entered Paris, an unknown general named de Gaulle broadcast from London, calling for continued resistance. Hardly anyone heard him then. Most French considered him a traitor who was splitting the nation and kowtowing to the English. But everyone listened to Pétain. His portrait hung in every town hall, every school. Children sang a song called Marshal, nous voilà. Marshal, here we are. He was an idol. And this, perhaps, is the most frightening part. The nation itself followed him. The nation was tired, wanted peace, believed the old hero knew what he was doing. Only when the Germans occupied the southern zone in November 1942, when the French fleet was scuttled by the French themselves at Toulon to prevent its capture, did many begin to see clearly. It turned out Vichy had no independence, that Pétain was just a puppet, and that they had been deceived not only by Hitler but also by their own idol. The trial, an old man in the dock. Summer 1945. The war in Europe is over. Pétain, whom the Germans had taken to Sigmaringen Castle in Germany in August 44, is found by the Allies. And then the unexpected happens. The 89-year-old Marshal voluntarily returns to France. He could have gone to Switzerland, Spain, Latin America, but he returns to stand trial. Why? Because he still considers himself innocent. He's sure the court will acquit him, that the French will understand. He was saving them. On July 23, 1945, the trial begins. It's the most sensational case in 20th century French history. The courtroom in the Palais de Justice is packed to the rafters. The whole world watches this decrepit old man in his marshal's uniform, without his medals. The prosecutor demands the death penalty for high treason. Prosecution witnesses, former resistance members, testify about the atrocities of the Vichy militia, the deportations, the execution of hostages. Defense witnesses, former ministers, generals, officials, say, Pétain created an umbrella under which France survived. He personally didn't order the repression. He just signed papers prepared by others. Pétain himself remains silent for most of it. Only at the end does he give a short speech. I am not guilty. I always served France. Only the French people can judge me, not this court. The verdict: death penalty, confiscation of property, stripping of ranks. But then de Gaulle intervenes. The general once taught by Pétain how to command a regiment. De Gaulle, who throughout the war embodied the other France, the France that didn't surrender. He could have let justice take its course. But he signs a pardon, commutes the execution to life imprisonment. Why? Some say out of respect for his age. Some say he believed France shouldn't imprison its own heroes, even fallen ones. Some say he understood. Executing Pétain would make the nation's split permanent. Better to lock him away somewhere far so everyone would forget him. Pétain is sent to a prison on the Isle d'Yeu, off the Atlantic coast. He'll die there in 1951 at the age of 95. Pétain's shadow. Why France can't forget. It would seem the story is over. The traitor is punished. Justice prevails. But no. As early as 1951, Pétain's lawyers create an association to defend his memory. They gather tens of thousands of signatures demanding his remains be reburied in Verdun. Among the graves of the soldiers he led into battle in World War I. The government refuses. Then World War I veterans, 800,000 of them, demand the verdict be reviewed. Can you imagine the scale? Nearly 1 million people believe the traitor was actually a hero. And this conflict hasn't subsided to this day. Why? Because Pétain's trial wasn't just a trial of one man. It was a trial of all of France. Of the French who didn't join the resistance. Of those who worked for the Germans. Of those who remained silent when neighbors were taken to camps. Of those who just wanted to live. And if Pétain is a traitor, then who are they? I read a fantastic phrase in a book once. Treason is a matter of dates. Meaning, today you can be a traitor and tomorrow a hero if the situation changes. In 1940, Pétain was a hero to 90% of the French. In 1944, a traitor. And in 1950, for many, he became a hero again because the Cold War had started and an image of a firm hand, a fighter against communism, was needed. Historian Julian Jackson, who wrote a massive book about the Pétain trial, says this is a historical drama that has no end. And indeed, every time France faces a crisis, Peytain's shadow reappears. In the 1980s, when Nazi criminals like Klaus Barbie were tried, it emerged that many French officials knew and helped. In the 1990s, President Chirac officially recognized France's responsibility for the deportation of Jews. For the first time, a head of state stated that the Vichy regime wasn't an anomaly but part of French history. And in the 2020s, with the rise of right-wing ideas, neo-Pétainists have reappeared. Eric Zemmour, who ran for president, openly said Pétain saved French Jews, which, to put it mildly, contradicts the facts. And this resonates with voters. People want a strong leader who says, "I will protect you, even at the cost of freedom." Personal take: what Peytain's story teaches us. I've thought about this story for a long time, and you know what conclusion I've reached? Pétain is a mirror, and everyone sees their own reflection. For some, he's a symbol of cowardice. A man who had everything to fight: authority, power, popular support, but gave up without a fight. Because he was afraid. Because at 84, it's easier to negotiate than to fight. For others, he's a symbol of wisdom. He understood that resistance was futile and chose the lesser evil. He preserved the country even in a reduced form. For me, this story is about how no past merits grant immunity for the future. You can be a hero of Verdun and 20 years later become a Nazi collaborator. Because the world changed, but you froze in your greatness. Because instead of looking forward, you looked back. Because you were so sure of your own rightness that you stopped seeing reality. Pétain never truly understood what he'd done. He died believing he was right. That, perhaps, is the most terrible punishment, to die without acknowledging your guilt. And for us, living today, this story is a warning about how easy it is to slide into collaborationism if you desperately want peace. How easy it is to justify betrayal with higher interests. How easy it is to believe a strong leader promising order, and not notice that this order is built on blood. You know why I wrote about this today? Because this story is repeating itself before our eyes. Not literally, of course, but the essence is the same. When tough times come, people always divide into those ready to fight and those ready to negotiate with the victor. And those who negotiate always find justifications. It's better for everyone. We must save what we can. We'll sort it out later. And then comes the judgment of history. And it always turns out to be more complex than the black and white hero/traitor scheme. Pétain died in prison, but his name still tears France apart. And perhaps that is the most honest verdict. Not execution, not pardon, but an eternal argument. An eternal reminder that there is always a choice. And that the price of that choice can be higher than you are willing to pay. Now, friends, I want to hear your opinion. Can you understand Pétain? Maybe in his place you would have done the same? Or is this a betrayal that has no and can have no forgiveness? Write in the comments. Let's have a real, adult conversation without shouting or insults. Just try, together, to untangle this dark story. And, of course, subscribe to the channel. There are many more such tangled, ambiguous historical narratives ahead that make you think, argue, and feel. Thanks for reading to the end. You made it through almost 5,000 words of dense text. That's worth a lot. See you in the next episodes.